The day Garrett Blackwell was laid to rest, the small Texas town of Laredo bore witness to something so extraordinary that it would be recounted in hushed voices for generations to come. Stories of miracles have long been told across dusty plains, but this one was different. It was no preacher's parable or fireside tale meant to stretch for entertainment. It was real, and the truth of it was as tangible as the beating heart of a bear named Shadow. In a time and place where bonds between humans and animals ran deep, a quiet farmer's connection to a wild creature proved stronger than even death itself. Garrett Blackwell was a man of few words and simple ways. A farmer by trade and a bachelor by choice, Garrett spent his years tending to a modest plot of land outside Laredo, Texas. At 58, his skin was weathered by the relentless sun, and his calloused hands told a story of hard labor and honest living. He spoke little, laughed even less, and kept to himself for the most part. Yet, for all his gruff exterior, Garrett had a heart that recognized pain both in people and in animals. It was that silent empathy that led him, one late spring morning, to a discovery that would change his life. The Rio Grande was unusually high that year, its swollen currents carrying more than water downstream. Garrett had gone to check on his cattle when he spotted something on the riverbank, a dark shape, unmoving, partially tangled in reeds. At first glance, it looked like the remnants of a large carcass washed ashore. Curious and cautious, Garrett drew closer and realized it was a bear cub, small, fragile, and far too still for an animal that should have been wild with fear. The cub's fur was matted with mud, and its breathing was shallow. Garrett stopped a few paces short, expecting to see a mother bear nearby, but the area was eerily quiet. "Poor thing," Garrett murmured under his breath. He crouched low, careful not to startle the young creature. Its eyes fluttered open at his voice, black as coal, but dull and unfocused. It was dying. Garrett could have walked away. Logic and instinct told him not to interfere with nature's course, but something inside him wouldn't allow it. He fetched a tarp from his truck, scooped the cub into his arms, and brought it home. Word spread quickly around Laredo. Garrett Blackwell had brought home a bear cub. People whispered about the farmer's odd choice. Some said it was foolhardy, raising a wild animal would only end in disaster. Others believed it was dangerous. But Garrett ignored the gossip. He named the cub Shadow, a nod to the dark fur that clung to the bear like night itself. Nursing the animal back to health became his quiet obsession. Garrett fed Shadow milk with a cloth rag, cleaned the mud and grime from its fur, and even built a small enclosure beside the barn to keep the cub safe. The weeks turned into months. Shadow grew strong under Garrett's care, her small frame filling out with muscle, and her eyes regaining their sharp, wild gleam. But something unexpected happened during those days. Garrett and the bear forged an unspoken bond. Shadow was unlike any animal Garrett had known. Though her instincts were wild, she seemed to recognize Garrett as something more than just her caretaker. She followed him as he worked the fields, sometimes sitting like a sentinel as he repaired fences or tended cattle. Garrett spoke to her often in low, quiet tones as though she understood every word. "You and me, girl," he'd say, scratching behind her ears. Two souls trying to make sense of this world. For Garrett, the bear became his only companion. The farm, once filled with silence, now had life. The years passed, and Shadow became a towering presence on Garrett's farm, a massive black bear, strong and sleek. She wandered freely but never strayed far from the property, always returning to the barn at night or resting beneath the old oak tree beside Garrett's house. To the townsfolk, the sight of a full-grown bear living alongside a man became a local legend. Children would dare each other to sneak glimpses of Shadow from the fence line, and travelers passing through would ask about the farmer and his tame bear. Garrett, for his part, took no interest in the attention. Shadow was not a pet, and he made that clear to anyone who asked. She was his friend. But time is relentless, even for friendships as extraordinary as theirs. By his mid-60s, Garrett's health began to fail. He had trouble breathing, and his steps grew unsteady. The once strong farmer who could lift bales of hay without effort now found himself wheezing with even the smallest task. The bear, with her silent intuition, seemed to understand something was wrong. She would wait by the house for Garrett to come outside, often peering through the windows with those deep black eyes, as if to say, "I'm here." As Garrett's condition worsened, he spent more time sitting on his porch, watching the sunset bleed into the horizon. Shadow would rest nearby, her massive frame curled on the grass. The two sat in companionable silence, as they always had. It was on one such evening that Garrett spoke words he had never said aloud before. "Thank you, girl. You've been good to me." Shadow raised her head slightly, as if she understood the weight of his gratitude. On a cool autumn morning, Garrett Blackwell didn't wake up. When a neighbor came to check on him, they found him sitting in his chair by the window, his eyes closed, hands folded across his chest, peaceful as though he had merely fallen asleep watching the dawn. The news of his death spread quickly. Though Garrett had kept to himself, his story was well known, and the townsfolk mourned him as one of their own. Plans for the funeral were made, and the small churchyard just outside of town was chosen as his resting place. In the days leading up to the funeral, Shadow became restless. She prowled the farm, her mournful sounds carrying across the fields at night. She refused to eat, refused to settle, and when Garrett's body was taken from the house, she followed, watching the hearse disappear down the dirt road. The funeral was held on October 9th, under a grey sky that threatened rain. Family, neighbors, and townsfolk gathered around the grave, sharing stories of Garrett's quiet kindness and unyielding strength. The minister spoke solemnly, his voice echoing across the churchyard. But as the coffin was lowered into the earth, a disturbance broke the solemnity. From the far edge of the churchyard, a deep sound rose, a growl that sent chills through every mourner present. Heads turned toward the source, and there, emerging from the trees, was Shadow. Her massive form was impossible to miss. The bear had broken free of her enclosure and tracked Garrett to the funeral. Her black fur bristled as she approached, her movements deliberate and filled with purpose. "Is that the bear?" someone whispered. "Someone get back," another voice called. But Shadow ignored them all. Her eyes were fixed on one thing, Garrett's coffin. She moved closer, her growls turning to mournful roars that echoed through the clearing. The townsfolk backed away, their shock giving way to fear. No one dared to interfere. Then, with an earth-shaking force, Shadow charged. The bear struck the coffin with a massive paws, the sound of splintering wood cutting through the stunned silence. Mourners screamed and scattered as Shadow struck again, her roars mixing with the splintering of the wooden casket. A crack appeared, and Shadow stopped, her breath heaving. Someone stop her. But before anyone could move, a faint sound emerged from within the coffin. A cough. The crowd fell silent as the undertaker and the doctor moved cautiously forward. When they opened the cracked coffin, the impossible was revealed. Garrett Blackwell was alive. Garrett gasped for air, his chest rising and falling as though he had awoken from a deep sleep. The doctor knelt beside him, examining the farmer's pulse, his expression one of disbelief. "He's alive," the doctor said, his voice shaking. It must have been catalepsy, a condition where the body mimics death. Murmurs of awe rippled through the crowd. People stared at Shadow, who now sat quietly beside the open grave, her dark eyes fixed on Garrett. She knew. Someone whispered. It was true. Shadow had sensed what no one else could. She had saved him. Garrett, weak but conscious, turned his head toward the bear. In a voice barely louder than a whisper, he spoke. "You knew, didn't you, girl?" Shadow let out a low, rumbling sound, neither a growl nor a roar. It was something gentler, something only Garrett could understand. Epilogue, a bond beyond death. Garrett Blackwell returned to his farm. His life forever changed. Word of the miracle spread far beyond Laredo, and people came from all over to see the bear that had saved a man's life. Yet Garrett refused to let Shadow become a spectacle. She remained his quiet companion, the one soul who had refused to let him go. Years later, when Garrett finally passed this time for good, Shadow stayed by his grave for days, her mournful roars echoing through the fields. Some say she was never seen again, fading back into the wilderness like a ghost. But those who knew the story understood one thing. The bond between Garrett Blackwell and his bear was more powerful than anyone could explain. It was a bond born of trust, loyalty, and the quiet understanding shared between two unlikely souls. The story of Garrett and Shadow serves as a reminder of the profound connections we can share with the animals around us. It speaks to loyalty, intuition, and the mysteries of life that science alone cannot explain. Sometimes the greatest miracles come not from men, but from the wild. Story 2. Snow fell softly on the Alaskan wilderness, as if the earth itself were exhaling. The world seemed hushed beneath a blanket of white, muffling the sounds of the forest and river. It was the kind of stillness that could feel both peaceful and ominous, depending on who was listening. In the small village of Talkeetna, tales of the wilderness were a way of life, stories shared over fires, passed down through generations, but none of them compared to the story of Ellie Mackenzie and the bear that saved her life. It was the kind of tale that made people question what they thought they knew about animals, instincts, and the thin line between life and death. Ellie Mackenzie had always been a solitary figure, even as a child. Born and raised in the village of Talkeetna, a remote outpost north of Anchorage, she spent most of her life in her family's cabin at the edge of the forest. Her parents, both hunters and trappers, had taught her everything she knew about survival. Ellie could build a fire with wet wood, hunt and clean game, and navigate the wilderness with ease. When her parents died in a car accident during a rare trip to Anchorage when she was 19, Ellie inherited their land and cabin. She never left. By the time she turned 27, Ellie was known as the quiet Mackenzie girl to the villagers, someone who kept to herself, but was always dependable. She made a modest living by crafting fur-lined garments and guiding travelers brave enough to trek into the Alaska range. Most of the villagers liked Ellie well enough, but she was a mystery to them. Tom Winters, her nearest neighbor, often checked on her out of habit, though he rarely received more than a polite nod and a few words. "You're going to be buried out here one day," Tom would tease, shaking his head. Ellie never minded the solitude. For her, the forest wasn't lonely. It was alive, a vast, ever-changing presence that hummed with its own rhythms and mysteries. And it was on one fateful morning in early spring that Ellie's life changed forever. Spring came slowly in Talkeetna. Snow still clung to the ground like a stubborn guest, but the edges of the Talkeetna River were beginning to thaw. Ellie walked the trails near her cabin that morning, searching for early signs of life, the flash of green beneath snow, the bubbling of open water. At first, she thought it was the wind, a soft, low whimper carried on the breeze. She paused, straining her ears, and heard it again. It wasn't the wind, it was an animal. Ellie followed the sound, leaving the path and pushing through a thicket of birch trees. The crying grew louder, more urgent, until she stumbled upon the source. Lying in a hollow beneath a fallen tree was a bear cub. It was small, its black fur damp and clumped with mud. Its eyes were wide with fear, and its tiny chest rose and fell in quick, uneven breaths. Ellie's first instinct was to look for the mother bear. She scanned the trees, listening for rustling, but there was nothing, only silence. The cub was alone. Ellie crouched down slowly, her heart beating faster. She knew better than to interfere with wildlife. Every Alaskan did. Leave them be, it was a rule written into every survival guide and spoken by every old-timer in the village. But as Ellie looked at the small, shivering creature, she felt something stir deep inside her. A memory of her parents, maybe, or of herself as a child, alone and afraid. "All right," she murmured, shrugging off her heavy coat. "I can't just leave you here." She wrapped the cub in her coat and held it close to her chest, feeling the rapid flutter of its heartbeat against her own. It was risky, she knew, but it was a risk she was willing to take. The bear cub weighed no more than a sack of flour. Ellie carried him back to her cabin, half expecting to see an angry mother bear emerge from the trees at any moment. But no bear came. Inside the warmth of the cabin, Ellie placed the cub near the wood stove, rubbing its fur with a dry towel to chase away the chill. "You're lucky I found you," she said softly, as though the cub could understand. She fed it milk mixed with water, holding a rag to its mouth so it could suckle. The cub's tiny paws battered at the cloth, and for the first time, Ellie saw a spark of life in its eyes. "You'll need a name," she said, studying him. "Denali." The name fit. It was strong, like the great mountain that rose beyond the village, and it spoke of the wild of survival. Ellie didn't intend to keep Denali. She knew the dangers of raising a wild animal for both of them. Her plan was simple: nurse the cub back to health, then let him return to the forest where he belonged. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Denali grew stronger with each passing day, his fur becoming sleek and glossy, his small frame filling out. Ellie built a pen for him behind the cabin, reinforced with wood and wire to keep him safe and to keep him out of trouble. Raising Denali wasn't easy. He was mischievous and curious, always finding ways to escape the pen or knock things over inside the cabin. Ellie would scold him in a firm voice, only to catch him staring at her with wide, innocent eyes. "You're trouble, you know that." She'd grumble, though she couldn't help but smile. Despite his antics, Denali was different. Ellie felt it. He never growled or showed aggression. He followed her everywhere, to the river, to the trails, even into the village when she made supply runs. At first, the villagers were wary. Tom Winters warned her outright, "Bears aren't pets, Ellie. He'll turn on you one day. Mark my words." Over time, the bear became a fixture in Ellie's life. When she sat by the fire at night, Denali lay beside her, his great head resting on her feet. He watched her with eyes that seemed to hold a wisdom far beyond his years. Ellie spoke to him often, as though he were human. "You're going to leave someday," she'd tell him. "That's how it's supposed to be." But as the seasons passed, Denali stayed. The winter that year was worse than anyone in Torquay could remember. Snow buried the cabins up to their windows, and temperatures plunged to deadly lows. Ellie stocked up on firewood and food, ready to ride out the storm, but nothing could prepare her for what was coming. It started with a cough, small at first, just a tickle in her throat. By mid-January, the cough had worsened. Ellie felt it deep in her chest, a burning that left her gasping for breath. Then came the fever. She tried to fight it off, stoking the fire and drinking tea, but her strength faded. Soon, Ellie couldn't get out of bed. The cabin grew colder as the fire dwindled, the woodpile untouched. Denali knew something was wrong. The bear paced outside the cabin, leaving great tracks in the snow. He pressed his nose to the window, letting out low, anxious grumbles, but Ellie was too weak to answer. Days passed in a blur. Ellie drifted in and out of consciousness, her body shivering beneath the blankets. She dreamed of the river, of her parents' voices, and of Denali's dark eyes watching her. Denali's behavior changed on the 5th day. When Ellie didn't respond to his growls, the bear began to claw at the cabin door. He struck it with his massive paws, splintering the wood with each blow. In the village, Tom Winters noticed that Ellie hadn't come to collect her mail or supplies in days. He knew she lived alone, and with the storm still raging, he decided to check on her. Tom arrived at Ellie's property just in time to see Denali slamming his weight against the cabin door. The sight stopped him cold. "What the hell?" Tom muttered, reaching for the rifle strapped to his snowmobile. But as he stepped closer, he realized Denali wasn't acting aggressively. The bear's cries were filled with distress, a deep, mournful sound that echoed across the frozen forest. Tom hesitated, then pushed forward. "Ellie," he called out, his voice nearly drowned by the wind. Tom swung his axe at the door, breaking it down piece by piece. When he finally stepped inside, the cold hit him like a wall. Ellie lay motionless on the floor, her face pale and her breathing faint. "She's alive," Tom shouted, dragging her toward the open doorway. Denali, who had been watching anxiously, let out a low-sound part growl, part sigh, as if he understood. Tom brought Ellie to the Torquay clinic, where the doctor confirmed she'd been hours from death. "Hypothermia and pneumonia," he told her later. "You're lucky you survived." But Ellie knew it wasn't luck. It was Denali. When she was strong enough to return home, she searched for him. She followed his tracks deep into the woods, calling his name. But Denali was gone. It was as though, having saved her life, he had returned to the wild where he belonged. The villagers spoke of it for years, the bear who refused to let Ellie die. Some called it instinct, others called it fate. Ellie never tried to explain it. She knew only that Denali had been more than a bear. He had been her companion, her guardian, a bond forged in the wild, unbreakable even in the face of death. Years later, as Ellie sat on her porch, an old woman now, she thought often of Denali. She wondered where he was, whether he had found peace in the wilderness he belonged to. Sometimes, When the snow fell quietly on the Alaskan forest, Ellie imagined she could hear him, a low, distant growl carried on the wind. And she would smile, knowing that some bonds, no matter how unlikely, can never truly be broken. If you found this video insightful, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications for the latest videos on wildlife safety, survival tips, and fascinating animal stories. Stay safe, stay informed, and we'll see you in the next one.